Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. My name is Anas Turkestani and I'm representing Zatka, the Zakat Tax and Customs Authority. And whether you are new to e-invoicing or looking to ensure your system is fully compliant with Zatka's e-invoicing integration requirements, this video will guide you step by step through the onboarding process, ensuring a smooth and straightforward experience. Bismillah, and let's get started. In this video, we will cover three main aspects. The first section we will be covering today is the introduction to Fatura. In this section, we will explore what Fatura means and the main aspects associated with Fatura. And for the second point, which is the Zatka supportive tools for integration. So far, Zatka has published several tools to support system developers in integrating their systems with the Fatura platform, and we will go through each one of those tools in detail. And for the last part we are covering, which is the onboarding process demo. Here, we will cover the full integration process with the Fatura platform by onboarding a device to the simulation environment. So, this video will not be just covering the theory of e-invoicing. It will also act as a guide with a hands-on experience of the integration process. So by the end of the video, you will have a better understanding of the integration process, inshallah. Now we are ready to move to the first section, which is Introduction to Fatura. So let's explore the main aspects associated with Fatura, and starting from the first point, which is e-invoicing. What is e-invoicing? E-invoicing is the process of converting paper invoices and notes into an electronic format, allowing for the structured exchange and processing of invoices, credit notes, and debit notes between buyers and sellers through an integrated electronic solution. For a long time ago, invoicing procedure was being performed manually and based on paper, and the time to digitalize this procedure has become. Let's move now to the next key concept, which is the e-invoice, the electronic invoice. The electronic invoice is a tax invoice generated in a structured electronic format through an electronic means, specifically in XML format. That means paper invoices converted through copying, scanning, or other methods are not considered as a valid electronic invoices. The valid electronic invoice should be generated in the right structure and format that comply with Zatka's standards and requirements. Now let's move to the next point, which is electronic invoice types. We mainly have two types of electronic invoices, which are the standard tax invoice and simplified tax invoice. And the main difference between those two types is that the standard tax invoice is issued by a business to another business, which makes it a B2B transaction. And for the simplified tax invoice, it's issued by a business to consumers, which makes it a B2B transaction. And that is the main difference between these two types of invoices. Now let's move to the last key point, which is Fatura phases. E-invoicing in KSA has been rolled out in phases. The phase 1, which was the generation phase, enforced as of December 4th, 2021 for all of the taxpayers in the kingdom, excluding non-resident taxpayers. In this phase, electronic invoice issuance was similar to invoices generated before December 4th, 2021, but with additional fields required depending on the transaction type. And we are currently on the phase 2, which has been enforced starting January 1st, 2023 in waves. Here, the electronic solution itself must be integrated with Zatka systems through the Fatura platform, and e-invoices should be generated in the required format in compliance with Zatka's requirements and standards. So how we can actually integrate our systems with Fatura platform? So we mainly have two approaches that the taxpayer can choose from to integrate their systems with Fatura. So the first approach is the in-house solution. This means that the integrated solution is being developed internally by the taxpayer's organization, and it's directly integrated with Fatura platform without involving a third party. Unlike the second approach, which is the solution provider approach, taxpayers can also choose a solution provider to handle the integration part for them. The list of approved solution providers is available on Zatka's website. It's worth to mention that there's no such restriction by Zatka regarding the followed approach. The taxpayers can choose any of those approaches that suit them the most. Now, we are ready to move to the next section, which is Zatka supportive tools for integration. As mentioned earlier, Zatka has developed several tools to assist taxpayers in integrating their systems with the Fatura platform. Let's explore them. The first tool is the Compliance and Enablement Toolbox Software Development Kit, SDK. This is an SDK has been published by Zatka, and it's an offline tool with pre-built functions such as XML e-invoice validation, QR code generation, and other features. Developers can use it to save time rather than building these functions from scratch. So the developers actually don't need to go from scratch to implement every feature to integrate with Fatura platform. They can directly access the pre-built features using the SDK. And it's worth to mention that using SDK is totally optional for the taxpayers. They can choose whether or not to use it. For the second tool, we have the web-based validator for non-technical users. This tool is designed for non-technical users who want to validate their e-invoices before submitting them to Zatka. As mentioned before, the electronic invoice should be generated in the right structure and format. So the non-technical users can validate their e-invoices to see whether it's valid and comply with the standards and regulations or not through the web-based validator tool. It features a user-friendly design and it's easy to use. You can access it on Zatka's website. Now, after we have covered the second tool, we will move to the third tool, which is Sandbox for API integration. The integration actually between the taxpayer solution and the Fatura platform is conducted through the APIs. Zatka Sandbox allows developers to explore and test each API required during the onboarding process. Developers can view API headers, body structures, and expected responses, and they can even test APIs using this tool. We will explore all of those tools in detail later in the onboarding process demo part. With that, we have covered the supportive tools for integration. Now, let's move to the next section, which is the integration journey. So, the journey towards the integration consists of 5 specific steps. The first step, which is generate a certificate signing request and key pair. For the second step, which is generating an OTP from the Fatura portal. And for the third step, which is requesting a compliance cryptographic stamp ID, which we call it CCSID. And for the fourth step, which is complete the compliance checks phase. And for the last step before the live integration, which is request a production cryptographic stamp ID or the production CSID. We will now explore each step in detail. Let's navigate to the first step in the onboarding process, which is generating a CSR with a key pair. The taxpayer is required to generate the CSR, which is essentially a request for the certificate. This request is submitted to Zatka through the Fatura platform. Zatka acts as the certificate authority to issue the compliance CSID, which is the first certificate needed to send invoices. In this step, taxpayer will fill in the information associated with the device and the CSR configuration file. Required information includes the VAT number of the taxpayer, the serial number of the device, the address, and other details. We will explore each required field later during the demo. So then the taxpayer must submit the CSR to Zatka through a specific API on the Fatura platform. And if the submission is correct, Zatka will automatically issue the compliance CSID. The certificate will be used in the compliance checks phase to send invoices. It is also important to note that the taxpayer must store the private key in a secure and safe location. Each certificate is associated with one private key, which is required for other operations on Fatura platform. The private key and public key known collectively as asymmetric cryptography. They work together to secure data and protect sensitive information. So it's the taxpayer's responsibility to store the private key in a safe location. And in case that the private key has been exposed to any unauthorized member, the certificate will not be longer active. So here the taxpayers is required in this scenario to revoke the certificate and to request for a new certificate that has a secured private key associated. Now, after we have generated our CSR, it's the time to move to the next step, which is the OTP generation. The next step is generating an OTP. It's a simple process where the taxpayer logs into their Fatura portal using their unique TIN number and password, and once logged in, they can select environment where they want to onboard the device on, simulation or production. The main difference between these two departments is that the simulation environment is only for testing purposes. That means taxpayers can test their systems before officially integrating with Fatura platform. While onboarding in the simulation environment is not mandatory, it's recommended to test your solution in such environment to identify and resolve any of the potential errors before the live integration. So that means each invoice submission in the simulation environment will not be captured by Zatka as a real invoice submission, unlike the production environment. Every invoice submission in the production environment will be captured as a real invoice and will be taken into an account. After selecting the environment, taxpayers can generate the OTP by clicking on Onboard a new device icon. They can generate up to 100 OTPs simultaneously, reflecting the number of the devices that need to be onboarded. Once generated, the OTP will be ready for use. We will explore the full OTP generation process during the demo part. Now, after we have generated our OTP, it's the time for us to move on to the next step, which is requesting a compliance CSID. The third steps involve requesting a compliance CSID, which is a certificate issued by Zatka for the compliance check space. And please note that without this certificate, invoices cannot be sent through the Fatura platform. So, after generating both CSR and OTP in the previous steps, taxpayers must submit them to the Fatura platform through a specific API. And if the submission is correct, Zatka will issue the certificate and return it in the API-specific response. The OTP should be included in the API header, while the CSR should be included in the body of the request. This part will be covered in more detail during the demo part of this video. After obtaining the compliance CSID, it's time to perform the compliance checks for the solution. In this phase, Zatka need to ensure that the taxpayer's device can send valid invoices before the live integration. During this phase, submissions are being sent for compliance assurance purposes, and as a result, the invoices submitted will not be considered as a real invoice submissions. Taxpayers can submit dummy invoices as long as they comply with the standards and regulations. The process involves generating an invoice and submitting it to the Fatura platform using the compliant CSID that has been generated from the previous step, and receiving a validation response indicating whether the submission passed or was rejected. Credit and debit notes must also be submitted during this phase. This step is essential for identifying any of the potential errors in the implemented solution and resolving them before obtaining the final certificate, which is the live integration phase. We will cover this step in detail during the practical demo. So now, after completing the compliance checks phase, taxpayers are ready to request the production CSID. This is the production certificate used to send real invoices to Zatka. To request the production CSID, taxpayer must submit a request to the Fatura platform with their request ID. The Fatura platform will verify whether all required compliance checks have been completed. And if all checks completed, then the Fatura platform will issue the production CSID and return it in the API response. The taxpayer can use the production certificate to send and share real invoices to Fatura platform. If any required compliance checks are incomplete, the platform will return an API response detailing the missing steps. For example, if the taxpayer forgot to submit a simplified debit note, they will receive it in the API response that indicates that they still have this document missing from the compliance checks phase, which allows the taxpayers to go to the previous step, which is the compliance checks phase, and complete all the missing types of documents. With this, we have completed the theoretical part of this video, and we are ready to move on to the practical demo. We will go through each step of the onboarding process and explore it hands-on. Stay focused. After completing the theoretical part of the integration, we are ready to move on to the practical steps. In this section of the video, we will explore the tools that will assist you in your e-invoicing integration journey, and we will also onboard a device to the simulation environment as promised. But before diving into the practical steps, let's take a closer look at Zatka's website and what it offers for e-invoicing. This is an essential starting point as the website provides all the resources needed to successfully begin the integration process. First, let's start with the educational library. The educational library contains a wealth of valuable documents and manuals, and we highly recommend reviewing these materials before starting the onboarding process. Some of the most important resources include the E-Invoicing Detailed Technical Guideline and E-Invoicing Detailed Guidelines, and so on. These documents are incredibly useful and will play a crucial role in guiding you through the onboarding process, and you will definitely need them in your integration journey. So please make sure to review all of these materials before kicking off the onboarding process. Alright, returning to the e-invoicing main page, you will find the Solution Providers section. This section lists the qualified solution providers for Phase 2 and Phase 1 of e-invoicing. And as we discussed earlier, taxpayers can either choose to handle the integration themselves or hire one of these qualified solution providers to manage the process for them. So you will find all of the qualified solution providers for Phase 2 in this list. Now, let's return to the main page of e-invoicing to navigate to the developer portal by simply clicking on System Developers icon, and the e-invoicing developer portal will appear. The developer portal offers a variety of Zatka's published tools that support the integration, the tools that we have just talked about in the theoretical part, such as the SDK, web-based validator, and so on. And let's start with the web-based validator tool. As mentioned before, each tax document is required to be compliant with Zatka's requirements and standards. And as we can see here in the diagram, we have three main validation criteria levels, which are the UBL specifications, and for the content validation, we have the EN and KSA business rules and standards. And this tool allows non-technical users to validate any electronic tax invoice to check whether it's fully compliant with all of those three levels of requirements or not. So let's start testing this tool to see how it works. First, let's click on the icon of the tool, and here is a small description of the tool, and we should accept the terms and conditions. And then simply we will upload an XML document invoice and then press validate. As we can see here, the result of the validation indicates that there are no errors found. So this means that this invoice is 100% compliant with all of the three levels of requirement in the tax invoice. But what if there was an invoice that has an error associated? So let's retest the validation and upload an invoice with an error to see what the response will look like. And here it goes. The validation result will indicate if there's any error of the three levels of validation, and in this invoice, the error falls under the category of the content validation. So this tool not only informs you if the invoice is valid or not, but it also points the specific error category and the error code, which makes it easier for non-technical users to identify and fix issues in XML document. So after we have finished with the web-based validator, let's explore the next tool, which is the API Integration Sandbox. As mentioned earlier, the integration between the Fatura platform and the taxpayer solution is achieved through API integration. Zatka has created a virtual environment, the sandbox, where the system developers can test APIs, review API structures, and explore the expected responses of each API required in the integration process. And it's worth to mention that it's not necessary to have any Fatura portal credentials to use the sandbox environment. So that means any system developer can actually go and interact with the sandbox environment without any TIN number and password. It's free and public for everyone to use. But it only has a static data associated, so in order to test your system using the real data of the taxpayer, in that scenario, you need an access to Fatura portal to use the simulation environment. Alright, now let's go and explore each section of the sandbox website. First, we have the API Integration Sandbox releases. So Zatka puts a consistent effort to maintain and improve the sandbox environment. So you can expect a different releases that have a fixes, upgrades, and so on. So you can track all of the changes that have been applied to each version of the sandbox documented here in this section. Alright, now let's navigate to the left section of the webpage, which is the API documentation guide. In this section, we have each API required during the onboarding process described in detail. And let's start with the compliance CSID API, which is the first API to interact with during the onboarding process. So scrolling down, we have the OTP and the accept version, which are the headers of this API. And we also have the request body, which is the CSR. And if we remember from the theoretical part, the first step during the onboarding process was actually generating the CSR. And here where we will be sending our generated CSR with the OTP. So if the submission is successful, we will receive a 200 successful response with our generated and issued compliance CSID in terms of binary security token and secret. And this compliance CSID will be used during the next steps of the onboarding. And this is a successful response example. What are unsuccessful responses should look like? So first we have 400, that means a bad request. Maybe we have an invalid OTP. If the provided OTP is invalid or missing CSR or invalid CSR, if we have generated the CSR in incorrect format, we will probably receive this error. And here we can see all of the different types of responses for this specific API. Alright, now let's navigate to the next API to interact with, which is the compliance invoice API, the compliance checks phase. If we remember this phase from the theoretical part, this phase was about to ensure our system is able to send a valid invoices to Fatura platform. And if we scroll down here, we can see the first header, which is the authorization, a basic authentication, which contains the username and password. So the username will be the binary security token obtained from the previous step, alongside with the password, which will be the secret, and alongside with accept language and the accept version. And we also have the request body, which includes the tax document itself. So we have the invoice hash, the UUID, and the invoice. So if you want to know more about the invoice hash and the UUID, please refer to the E-Invoicing detailed technical guideline. In that document, both of those attributes are described in detail. And regarding the invoice, we have it in base 64 format. So we will encode the invoice from XML to base 64. And if the submission is successful, we will receive a 200 response reported. And in case that our submission is not successful, we will have a 400 error or 401, depends on the error category that we are receiving. Alright, now let's navigate to the last step after we have completed all of the compliance checks, which is the production CSID request. In this API, the headers are the authorization and the accept version. And the authorization will be the same as the previous API, the binary security token and the secret obtained from the first API, which was the compliance CSID API. And regarding the request body, it will be the compliance request ID, which also has been obtained from the first API, as we can see here in the screen. And if the submission is successful, we will receive a production CSID in terms of binary security token and secret, the same format of the compliance CSID. So this CSID will be used to send real invoices to Zatka through reporting or clearance APIs. So the difference between reporting API and clearance API, that the reporting API is for simplified tax invoices and the clearance is for standard tax invoices. So returning to the production CSID to see the other types of responses, such as 400. Maybe one of the compliance checks is missed. So Fatura platform will check all of the compliance checks, and if they are all submitted successfully, then it will issue the production CSID. If one of the compliance checks is missed, that means you will get a 400 error. And also regarding 401 error, returned when username and password are not added or added as wrong values. So maybe either the binary security token or the secret have been entered in the authorization header incorrectly. And you can see all of the other types of responses described in detail here in the API documentation guide. All right, so now moving to the reporting API, and it has the authorization header, which contains the username and the password, and it should be the production certificate that has been obtained from the production API, not the compliance API. So that's the difference between the compliance CSID API and the production CSID API. That the compliance CSID API, the certificate received will be only used for the compliance checks, but for the production CSID API, the production CSID returned will be used for both reporting and clearance that will be sending the real invoices to Fatura platform. And again, with the other headers such as the accept language, etc., we have the request body, the same as the compliance checks structure, and the same expected responses. So we also have the production CSID renewal and the production CSID onboarding. What are the difference between those two APIs? In fact, they are both contains the same endpoint, but please note that the production CSID has an expiry date of 5 years. So for every 5 years, you are required to request to renew your production certificate to ensure that it runs smoothly and correctly. With that, we have covered all of the APIs in the API documentation guide, and we are ready to move to the next tool, which is the compliance and enablement toolbox and SDK. So the E-Invoicing SDK is a software development kit that has been published by Zatka with a pre-built functions to use. So the system developers don't need to start from scratch in developing the solution. They can use those ready functions and features available in the SDK to help them in the integration. Let's explore the web page of the SDK to see what are those sections. First, we have the first section, which is download SDK. Basically, you accept the terms and conditions after reading it carefully and download the SDK, whether it's the normal SDK or simulation SDK or the beta version SDK. And for the SDK support, you will see a high-level guideline on how to use the SDK and other instructions on how exactly to install it and use it. And for the next section, which is the e-invoice specifications. Now, as mentioned before, that each invoice should be compliant with Zatka standards and regulations. So those manuals are very important to read, which contains all of the required elements based on the invoice type and other business rules required in your invoice to make it compliant with Zatka's regulations and standards. Now, moving to the last section, which is version history. As mentioned before, Zatka puts a high consistent efforts to develop and maintain all of the integration supportive tools, and the SDK is one of them. So you can expect many versions of the SDK, and each new version comes with upgrades, fixes, and etc. And if you press on any SDK version, you will see what exactly has been changed in this exact version. So it's always recommended to use the latest version of the SDK. So let's go and download our SDK. We accept the above terms and conditions, and we have two versions of the SDK, Java version and .NET version. For the Java version, a JDK version 11 is required. For the .NET version, a .NET Core 8 version as a prerequisite to install the E-Invoicing SDK is also required. So please make sure to have the correct version of either JDK or .NET installed in your machine before installing the SDK. So simply click on install, then we install it as a zip file. So we are now downloading the .NET version. And here we can see it started to successfully downloading. Now, after the SDK has been successfully downloaded, it's the time for us to install the SDK. So simply open the SDK folder and then navigate to lib folder .NET 8 and then install .NET. After that, the SDK will be successfully installed to our machine. And to check whether if it's successfully installed or not, just simply open the CMD and type this command, which is فاتورة .NET. This command is for .NET version. If you are using Java version, then the command will be just فاتورة. But currently, we are using the .NET version, so the command will be فاتورة .NET. And then we can execute the command. If the response is received, which is welcome to Zatka E-Invoice.NET SDK, specifying the exact version that we have downloaded, then it means that the SDK is successfully installed. Alright, before start using the SDK, it's important to go through the README file, which you can find it here in the README section. The README file contains an important information on how exactly you can use the SDK and what are the commands, like the generate hash command, CSR generation command, and other important commands that you will be required to use in order to integrate your system with Zatka Fatoura platform if you are willing to use the SDK. So please make sure to read all of the README file carefully. Now let's explore the important elements of SDK in data folder. If we open data folder, first we have the certificates folder. And then we have the cert file and then the private key file. This is a sample of the certificate and the private key. And in the demo part, we will get to know on how we can exactly generate both the certificate and the private key. And then we have input, which contains the CSR configuration example that is required to be filled by the taxpayer to generate the CSR. And then we have the PIH, the previous invoice hash. And this value will be included in the first invoice that will be sent from the onboarded solution. And we also have the rules and schemas required to make the tax invoices compliant with the Zatka standards and regulations. And we also have samples of those valid and compliant invoices. We have samples for standard, simplified, and even PDF A3, which is the human readable format, electronic invoices. So let's go with simplified, and we also have the simplified invoice, debit note, and credit note. And let's open the simplified invoice XML file, and this is a sample of a valid simplified tax invoice. This is the electronic invoice and how it should look like. So you can have those as a reference for you to see how the valid invoices look like with different scenarios such as export invoices, self-billing invoice, third-party billing invoice, etc. And it will help you to develop your system to generate a valid and compliant invoices. And now let's run some simple commands to see what are the functions that may help you towards the integration process. First, let's start with validate. So this function is really useful to see whether the invoice that you have generated is compliant with Zatka standards and regulations or not. So let's run this command. And then execute it. As you can see here that all of the validation criteria are success. That means this invoice is successfully compliant with the Zatka's regulations and standards. And we also have QR code function which help us to generate a valid and compliant QR code for our invoices. So let's run that command to see how it works. As we can see that the operation completed successfully and the generated QR code is returned in the response. And we also have the sign function which help us to sign our invoice or any other tax document such as the credit note or debit note. And please note that signing is only required for simplified tax invoices. As we can see here that the invoice has been signed successfully and the new returned invoice hash is also returned in the same response. And the signed invoice itself is being populated in the same directory of the original invoice that we have signed. If we can open it, we can see that the signed invoice in XML format. With that, we have covered some basic functions of the SDK. Please make sure to go to the README file to see all of the functions and how you can exactly use it to integrate your system with Fatura platform. With that, we have covered all of the supportive tools, and now we are ready to move to the last part of our video, which is the practical demo. Now we will be onboarding a device to the simulation environment. Stay focused. Alright, we are finally ready to start the practical demo part of the onboarding process. Bismillah, and let's get started. So first, let's start with the tools that we will need in order to onboard our device. First tool which we will be using today is the Postman. So Postman is basically an API platform tool that will enable us to interact with Fatura platform APIs. It's not mandatory, of course, to use Postman, but in today's video, we will be using Postman. And we also need an access to Fatura portal to obtain the OTP from, using the TIN number and the password of the organization. So let me put the password, and then an OTP will be sent to the registered phone number, and after entering it, we will be redirected to the Fatura portal. So from this icon, we can change the environment, whether we want to onboard on production or Fatura simulation. So in today's video, we will be onboarding our device to the simulation environment. So in order to go to simulation environment, we just simply press this icon and then accept the terms and conditions that simulation environment is only for testing purposes. And then we can go with next. And after that, we will be directed to Fatura simulation. And of course, we will be using our SDK that we have just downloaded from the previous section of this video. So those are all of the tools that will be utilized in today's practical demo. All right, let's get started by opening the Postman tool and create a new collection. And then you can choose any name that you want for the collection that you have created. In my case, I've named the collection with E-Invoicing video. After that, you create a request under that collection, add request, and here is the HTTP API request that we will be configuring. As we can see that we will be editing the authorization, the headers, the body, the endpoint of the API, and the method of the request. All of the API requests in the onboarding process will be post. Alright, the first thing, from where we can obtain the endpoints of our APIs. And the answer is from Fatura portal. Here we can see an icon with API documentation based on the environment that we have selected. After clicking on the API documentation, we can find all of the endpoints that we will be interacting with in today's onboarding process. And as we remember from the theoretical part, the first API to interact with, which is request a pre-compliance CSID. So simply copying this endpoint and pasting it here in this section in Postman. After that, we will go to the headers to specify the headers that included in the first APIs, and they were the OTP and the accept version. So the accept version will have the value of version 2, but what about the OTP? And the answer is from Fatura Portal. We will go to Fatura Portal and click on Onboard a new solution unit/device, and we will specify the number of the devices that we would like to onboard. In our scenario, we will only be generating one OTP because we are onboarding only one device. And then we click on Generate OTP code, and the OTP code will be populated. We will copy this code and paste it as the value in the OTP header. After that, we will move to the body. Then we will select raw, JSON format, and we will put the body structure. And here in the first API, we will be sending the CSR, as we remember from the theoretical part. We will be simply opening a curly brackets and then type a CSR in quotation marks, and then we put the value also of the CSR in quotation marks. And here is the question: how we can generate our CSR? So CSR can be generated from two main methods. The first method is by using our SDK, and the second method is by using OpenSSL tool. For now, we will be using our SDK to generate the CSR. Alright, so let's now navigate to the SDK folder so we can generate our CSR, and then open data folder, then input. And here we can see all of the configuration examples in the input directory of the SDK where we can generate our CSR from. So let's open the CSR config template, and here are all of the required fields that we need to fill. So those details are associated with each device that we would like to onboard, such as the common name of the device, the serial number of the device, the organization identifier of the device, and so on. We are requested to fill and create a new CSR each per new device that we would like to onboard. So let's start to fill these required elements that associated with the device that we are onboarding. First, let's start with the CSR common name. The CSR common name is basically the name or asset tracking number for the solution unit. It's a free text field. And going to the second field, which is the CSR serial number, which is basically the serial number associated with the device that we are onboarding. And the serial number should be in this format. First, 1 dash the name of the manufacturer or the solution provider of the device. And then we have this simple, and then 2 dash the model or version of the device, and then this symbol again, and then we press 3 dash and then the serial number of the device. So this is the specification of the serial number and how it should look like. It should be in this correct format so it can be accepted by Zatka's Fatura platform APIs. Otherwise, it will be rejected with 400 error that the CSR submitted is invalid. So please make sure to follow this format when entering the serial number of your device. Now moving to the next field, which is the organization identifier. It's basically the VAT number or group VAT registration number. It's a 15 digits that starts with 3 and ends with 3. And in this step, please make sure to use the VAT number associated with the Fatura portal that we have used to obtain our OTP from. And to do this, we can simply go to Fatura portal and copy the VAT number in the top right of the web page. And then we paste it in the CSR configuration template. Now moving to the next field, which is the organization unit name. In this field, the branch name basically is required for the taxpayers. And in case of VAT groups, this field should contain the 10-digit TIN number of the individual group member whose EGS unit is being onboarded. And going to the next field, which is the country name, which is the name of the country, but it should be the 2-letter code under the ISO 3166. In my case, I'll be using SA, which reflects Saudi Arabia. In the next field, we have the invoice type. As we remember from the theoretical part, we have two main types of the e-invoices. We have the standard tax invoice and the simplified tax invoice. So we can specify now what are the invoices that our solution will be generating. We can generate only simplified tax invoices if we would like to, and we also can generate only standard tax invoices if we would like to. And of course, we can optimize our solution to generate both of the simplified tax invoice and the standard tax invoices. So if we want to generate only standard tax invoices, we put the code 1000. But if we would like to generate only simplified tax invoices, we should put the code 0100. And if we would like to generate both of the simplified tax invoices and standard tax invoices, then we should put the code 1100. Please make sure to optimize this correctly, as it will be reflected during the onboarding process. And the next type, we have the location address, which is basically the location of branch or EGS unit. It's preferred to contain the short address format of the Saudi national address that's being obtained from Subul. And going to the last field, which is the industry business category, which is the industry or sector for which the device or solution will generate the invoices. Alright, after we have filled all of the required information, now we can save the file and close it. But please note that this video is only for testing and educational purposes, so that's why I've reflected a dummy data in my CSR configuration template. In your scenario, you should reflect the real data of the taxpayer or the organization. So please take that in note. And after that, we simply open the CMD in the same directory of the located config template. And if you remember, I'm using .NET version of the SDK, so this command is for .NET version. If you are using Java version, please use the command of Java version, which can be found on the README file. So let's type the command of CSR generation. And because we are in simulation environment, -sim flag should be typed. And then we execute the command. And after that, we can see that the operation completed successfully and both of the CSR and private key have been generated successfully. After that, we just simply open the CSR in any preferred tool. I prefer to use the notepad, and then copy the value of the generated CSR. And then we just simply paste it inside the API structure that we have just configured, and then we simply press send. And then as we can see that the request is successfully submitted and we have received the compliance CSID, which is the first certificate that we need in the next steps during the onboarding process, which are the binary security token and the secret. Please save those fields as you will need it during the next steps. You can save your request by simply click on the save icon on the top right of the Postman app. After that, the request will be saved. Alright, after we have obtained our compliance CSID, now it's the time for us to perform the compliance checks, the next step during the onboarding process. So, following the same approach we followed earlier for this request, we just simply create a new request under our collection and then put the method to post. And to get the URL, we simply navigate to Fatura portal and then go to API documentation, and here we can find the next endpoint that we will be using, which is being used to run the compliance checks for reporting and clearance. So let's copy the endpoint and paste it on the Postman environment. After we have inserted our endpoint correctly, it's the time for us to configure the other elements of this API. First, let's start with the authorization. From the authorization, we should select Basic Auth, which reflects the username and the password. And from the previous sections of the video, we got to know that the username in this request will be the binary security token obtained from the previous step. And regarding the password, it will be the secret. Please make sure to not to include any extra field or additional field such as the white spaces or any extra character, as it's really sensitive for the username and the password to be affected with those factors. So please make sure to copy as is from the previous API response. And after that, we should go to the headers to configure the other elements. The required headers in the compliance checks phase, which are the accept version, and it should has the value of v2. And we also have the accept language, and it's up to you whether to choose EN for English or ER for Arabic. In my case, I'll be using EN to have an English responses. Now let's move to the body and then select raw and JSON format. Now, what is required from us? If we remember from the CSR configuration template, we have optimized our solution to send both simplified and standard tax invoices. That means we are sending 6 types of documents in this compliance checks phase, because we are sending simplified tax invoice and simplified credit note and simplified debit note, and the same for the standard tax invoices. So we will be sending a simplified tax documents and standard tax documents. In this scenario, you can send a dummy invoices, as all of the invoices submissions in the compliance checks phase will not be captured by Zatka as a real submissions. So I'm using the samples located in the SDK folder. Navigating to data, then samples, then simplified. We can see a valid simplified invoice and credit note and debit note, and the same thing for the standard. So let's start with the standard tax invoice. First, you can open the standard invoice with any of your preferred tools. In my case, I prefer to use Notepad. And then we should ensure that the invoice is compliant with Zatka's regulations and standards. And since it's already located as a sample in the SDK folder, that means it's already compliant with all of the Zatka's regulations and standards. But we also need to change one thing inside the invoice, which is the company ID. The first company ID from the top of the invoice indicates the VAT number of the seller. So we should reflect that with the same VAT number that we have used to generate the OTP from. And after that, we just simply can save the file and close it. And then we can simply open the CMD in the same directory where the invoice is located and type this command. And remember, this command is for .NET version. If you are using the Java version SDK, please make sure to use the correct command, which is being specified in the README file. Alright, now the invoice request has been successfully generated. But what is the invoice request? It's an invoice ready in the JSON format, as you can see here. It includes the invoice hash and the UUID of the invoice and the invoice itself encoded in base 64. But since we have changed the company ID, that means we know. But since we have changed the company ID of the invoice, that means we should generate a new invoice hash for our invoice. Because in each change in the invoice data, that will reflect a new invoice hash. So to do that, we should navigate to the CMD again and type this command to generate the hash. And this command is also for .NET. If you are using Java version SDK, please navigate to the README file to see the correct command for Java version. So after specifying the right command, we can see that the invoice hash has been generated successfully. And this is the invoice hash. We should simply copy it and replace it with the old invoice hash. As we can see here that the invoice hash is already different. And then we can copy all of the request and paste it in the Postman body. And then we click send. And as we can see here that the request is successfully submitted with 200 OK response, which indicates that the invoice compliant and passed the validations. We should also perform the same with the standard debit note and credit note. So let's start with the standard credit note. To save the time, I've already performed the same steps that we have just followed and generated an invoice request in JSON format. I will simply copy that request and paste it to submit the standard credit note. And again, the 200 OK response is being received. That means that the standard credit note is cleared successfully. And now let's redo the same exact steps with the standard debit note. We simply go and copy the standard debit note JSON request and paste it inside the body of the request and press on send icon. And again, we are receiving 200 OK successful response, which means that the standard debit note has been successfully cleared. Now, if your solution is only optimized to send a standard tax documents, then you can go directly to the next step. But if your solution is optimized to send both of standard tax documents and simplified tax documents, you are required also to send the simplified tax documents, which are the simplified tax invoice and simplified debit note, credit note. The process of generating the invoice requests of the simplified documents is really similar to the standard ones, but there is one small difference, that the simplified tax invoices should be signed by the taxpayer certificate before sending it to Zatka. So now let's get started with the signing process and to see how we can exactly sign our simplified invoice. First, we need to ensure that the right certificate and the right private key is located in the certificates folder in this path. We should open the SDK folder, then navigate to data, certificates. We have the cert file, which we will include the certificate, and then the private key file, which we will include the private key. So now regarding the private key, it has been generated with the CSR automatically. So just open the private key in the notepad and then copy the value as is and paste it in this file. Now we are left with the certificate. How we can obtain this certificate? We just simply go to Postman and navigate to the first API, and then we copy the binary security token. Then navigate to any base64 decoder. So I have this open source tool to encode and decode in base64 format. We should select decode and paste our binary security token here. And then we should copy the decoded value and then paste it inside the certificate file. And then click save and close. And then we should navigate to the samples, simplified, and let's start with the simplified invoice. The first step, which is changing the company ID to our correct VAT number. Let's perform this step quickly and change the VAT number of the invoice. And then click save and close the file. And then we open the CMD to sign the invoice. The command that we are using is for .NET version of the SDK. If you are using Java version, please navigate to the README file to see the right command for Java version. So sign and selecting our invoice, and then the invoice will be signed successfully. And the signed invoice will be populated in the same directory of the original invoice that we have signed. And then we will generate the invoice request of the signed invoice. Please make sure to select now the signed invoice as the invoice that we want to generate the request for. And then the JSON request will be populated. For now, we don't need to generate the invoice hash because the invoice hash has been successfully changed during the signing process. Because the invoice hash is one of the elements included in the signing process. For more information about the full signing process, please refer to the E-Invoice detailed technical guideline, which located in the educational library that has been viewed during the previous section of this video. So simply copy all of this invoice request and paste it inside the body of the same request that we have just created to send the standard tax invoices without any change. The same endpoint, the same header, the same authorization, etc. After that, click on send. And as we can see here that we have received a 200 OK successful response with the status reported. And that's the difference between the standard tax documents and the simplified tax documents, that the simplified tax documents will be sent to the reporting API, but for the standard tax document will be sent through the clearance API. So now let's start with sending the simplified credit note. So just copy the same invoice request in JSON format and paste it to the body of the same API request and click on send. After that, we can see also that the credit note has been submitted successfully. Now doing the same with the simplified debit note. to submit it to the compliance invoice API. And then again, we have the reported response, which means that the simplified debit note has been reported and submitted successfully. For now, we have completed all of the compliance checks and we are ready to move to the next step, which is requesting for the production CSID. To perform that, let's initiate a new request under the same collection and change the method to post. And in order to obtain the endpoint, we just simply navigate to the Fatura portal and copy the endpoint of request or renew a production CSID. So simply select the endpoint and copy it to paste it in the URL section of our request. And in the authorization, we should select basic auth, and the username and the password will be the same of the compliance CSID. Then navigating to the headers, we have the accept version. And the value should be also v2. And then we should navigate to the body and select row JSON format and copy the compliance request ID from the same request of the compliance CSID. And then click on send. And as we can see here that in the response, we have successfully received the production CSID in terms of the binary security token and the secret. And this is the production CSID will be used to submit the real invoices through the reporting or clearance APIs depending on the type of the tax document. So let's try and test both reporting and clearance APIs to see how those APIs can be configured with the production CSID. First, again, we can go and add a request under the same collection, but let's save this request first. Right now we can go and change the method to post, and we can find the reporting and clearance APIs endpoints in Fatura portal. So let's go with the reporting API and paste it. And for the authorization, we should select basic auth. And now the username and the password should be changed from the compliance CSID to the production CSID. So this is the production CSID that we have just obtained. And we copy its binary security token and insert it in the username section. And the same for the password. We should copy the secret and paste it in the password section. After that, we should navigate to the headers and select accept language, which can be either English or Arabic, and also the accept version, which will be version 2. So now let's perform this step again. We go to a simplified invoice. Let's delete the old request and the old signed invoice and sign the invoice again with the production CSID. Right, now let's go and submit the signed invoice to the postman through the reporting API. As we can see here that the status is reported, but it contains a warning. What is the difference between 202, which means accepted with warnings, and 200 accepted without any warning? Invoices accepted with warnings should be fixed in future submissions to avoid any escalations, or fines from Zaatka. But receiving either reported or cleared status in the API response indicates that there is no any further changes or actions need to be taken from the taxpayer regarding the same submission. But the taxpayer should consider those types of warnings in the future submissions. So this was for reporting API. Let's test the clearance API. So first, let's add a request under the same collection that we have and change the method to post. And then let's navigate to Fatura portal to obtain the clearance API endpoint. And then simply paste it in the URL section of this API. And then for the authorization, we should collect basic auth, inserting the username and the password for the production CSID, of course. And after that, we have the headers, same as the reporting APIs, which is the accept language and the accept version. So we have the accept language and the accept version. And for the body, it should contain the invoice request containing the invoice hash, UUID, and the same invoice body encoded to base 64 for the standard tax invoices and other documents, such as the standard credit note and debit note. So let's go and submit a standard invoice. And click on send. And here we can see that the invoice has been successfully cleared. But there is only one difference, that there is a cleared invoice body returned in the same API response. What that means. So we have just discussed that signing the invoice for the standard tax documents is not required by the taxpayer because the Zaatka will sign the invoice for you, the standard tax invoices and the associated notes. So Zaatka will return the cleared and signed invoice in the same API response. And this is the version of the invoice that you would like to share with your clients and customers. Non-cleared invoices should not be shared with any of your clients and customers until it be cleared by Zaatka with 200 or 202 successful response, indeed with the cleared invoice body. For now, we have covered all of the APIs, the 3 onboarding APIs and the 2 core APIs, including the reporting and clearance. And if you navigate to Fatura portal and click on view list of solution and devices, you can clearly see that you have successfully onboarded your first device with Fatura portal, and all of those details have been inserted in the CSR configuration template. So, congratulations! Now you have successfully onboarded your first device to Fatura portal. For now, I wish you a very good luck to onboard your solution to the Fatura production environment. You must onboard your device to the Fatura production environment in order to be captured as a compliant with phase 2 requirements. All of the submissions in the simulation environment are not being captured as a real invoices. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you needed any further support or clarifications, please don't hesitate to reach out to us through any official channel and we would be more than happy to support you. Take care and goodbye.